They say pride comes before the fall, but nobody warned Sergeant Marcus Kane that his fall would come at the hands of someone half his size with twice his determination. In the unforgiving world of military training, where weakness is currency no one can afford, Marcus had built his reputation on breaking spirits and crushing dreams. But on that scorching Tuesday morning at Fort Braxton, he was about to encounter a force that would shatter his world in ways he never imagined possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun beat down mercilessly on the training grounds as the latest batch of recruits assembled for what they believed would be another routine physical assessment. Among them stood Lieutenant Sarah Chen, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with determined eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire that most people mistook for stubbornness. She had already endured 3 months of grueling training, each day bringing new challenges designed to separate the truly committed from those who were simply testing the waters. Marcus Kane stood 6 feet 2 inches of pure intimidation, his scarred hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the lineup like a predator selecting his next meal. His voice, when it finally cut through the morning air, carried the weight of 20 years of military service and countless broken dreams left in his wake. "Listen up, ladies and gentlemen," he barked, though his eyes seemed to linger on Sarah with particular interest. "Today we're going to find out who among you has what it takes to wear this uniform with honor and who needs to pack their bags and find a nice desk job somewhere safe and comfortable." Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her stomach, the same sensation she'd experienced every time someone had told her she wasn't strong enough, fast enough, or tough enough for this life she'd chosen. Growing up as the youngest of 4 brothers, she'd learned early that the only way to earn respect was to fight for every inch of ground, never backing down from a challenge no matter how insurmountable it seemed. The morning exercises began with standard calisthenics, but Marcus had something special planned. He'd been watching Sarah for weeks, noting how she consistently outperformed many of her male counterparts despite their obvious physical advantages. It bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate, challenging long-held beliefs about what a soldier should look like, sound like, and be capable of achieving. "Chen." His voice cracked like a whip across the training ground. "Front and center." Sarah stepped forward without hesitation, her chin held high, despite knowing that being singled out by Sergeant Kane was rarely a positive development. The other recruits watched with a mixture of sympathy and relief, grateful that they weren't the ones in his crosshairs today. "I've been watching you, Chen," Marcus continued, circling her slowly like a shark scenting blood in the water. "You think you're something special, don't you? Think you can waltz in here and show us all how it's done?" "No, Sergeant," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "I think I belong here, just like everyone else." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Belong here? You barely weigh what my pack weighs on a light day. You think this is some kind of game where participation trophies matter?" The insult hung in the air like smoke, but Sarah didn't flinch. She'd heard worse from her own brothers during their backyard wrestling matches, and she'd learned long ago that the best response to doubt was demonstration, not declaration. "I think actions speak louder than assumptions, Sergeant," she said quietly, and the assembled recruits collectively held their breath. Marcus's face darkened. In his world, recruits didn't talk back, didn't challenge authority, and certainly didn't question his judgment. This little woman was disrupting the natural order of things, and it was time to restore balance. "Is that so, Chen?" he asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Well then, Chen, let's see some action. Drop and give me 50 push-ups, real ones, not the modified garbage they'd probably taught you in whatever fitness class you crawled out of." Sarah dropped to the ground without hesitation, her form perfect as she began the exercise. 1, 2, 3, each repetition executed with military precision, while Marcus prowled around her, searching for any sign of weakness or compromise in her technique. "Faster," he commanded. "A real soldier doesn't have time to take breaks between push-ups." Sarah increased her pace, her breathing controlled despite the burn beginning to spread through her arms and chest. Around her, the other recruits watched in fascination as she maintained her form even as the count climbed higher. 35, 36, 37, Marcus counted out loud, his voice carrying a note of surprise that he tried to mask by continued aggression. He'd expected her to falter by now, to compromise her form or beg for mercy like so many others had before her. But Sarah kept going, each push-up a silent declaration that she refused to be underestimated or dismissed. The ground beneath her grew damp with sweat, but her resolve only seemed to strengthen with each passing repetition. The sun kept pounding, but so did Sarah's heart, each beat ticking down the seconds to victory and making sure no one would ever forget her name again. By the time Sarah reached 50 perfect push-ups, something had shifted in the atmosphere of the training ground. The other recruits were no longer watching with detached curiosity. They were witnessing something that felt almost mythical in its intensity. Here was someone their size, their age, defying everything they'd been told about limitations and expectations. Marcus, however, wasn't ready to concede anything. If anything, Sarah's display of competence only fueled his determination to find her breaking point. In his experience, everyone had one, and he'd made a career out of locating those pressure points with surgical precision. "Not bad, Chen," he said, his tone suggesting that 50 perfect push-ups were somehow inadequate. "But push-ups are just the warm-up. Let's see how you handle something that requires real strength." He gestured toward a series of obstacles that had been set up earlier that morning, rope climbs, wall traversals, and weighted carries that had defeated countless recruits before her. Sarah stood and brushed the dirt from her hands, her breathing already returning to normal as she assessed the challenges ahead. "The thing about real soldiers," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the training ground for everyone to hear, "is that they don't just need to be strong. They need to be unbreakable. When everything goes wrong, when your equipment fails, when your backup doesn't come, you need to find something inside yourself that most people don't even know exists." Sarah nodded, understanding that this was more than just a physical test. This was about proving that she belonged in a world that had traditionally excluded people like her, that she could be trusted with the lives of her fellow soldiers when everything went sideways. The first obstacle was a 30-foot rope climb, and Sarah approached it with the same quiet confidence she'd shown during the push-ups. Her technique was flawless. She'd practiced this particular skill until it became as natural as walking, knowing that in the military, there were no style points for almost getting something right. Hand over hand, her legs providing assistance without bearing too much weight, Sarah ascended the rope with a rhythm that spoke of countless hours of preparation. Marcus watched from below, his expression unreadable as she reached the top and began her controlled descent. "Time. 42 seconds, called out one of the other instructors who had been timing the exercise. It was a respectable time for anyone, and exceptional for someone of Sarah's size and build. But Marcus wasn't interested in respectable. He was interested in finding the limits of this recruit, who seemed determined to rewrite the rules about what was possible. "Again," he commanded. "A real soldier might need to do that 3 times in a row if the situation demands it." Sarah didn't argue or negotiate. She simply grabbed the rope again and began her second ascent, her movements still controlled and efficient despite the fatigue that was beginning to accumulate in her forearms and shoulders. The second climb took 48 seconds. The third took 53. By the fourth climb, which Marcus had demanded despite it being well beyond standard requirements, Sarah's time had stretched to nearly a minute and her breathing had become noticeably more labored. "Getting tired, Chen?" Marcus asked, though there was something in his voice that wasn't entirely mocking. "Maybe it's time to admit that some obstacles are just too big for some people." Sarah wiped the sweat from her eyes and looked up at the rope that had begun to feel like her personal nemesis. Her hands were beginning to burn from the friction, and her shoulders ached in ways that would make tomorrow morning an adventure in pain management. "One more time," she said quietly, and the words seemed to surprise everyone present, including herself. "What did you say?" Marcus asked, stepping closer. "I said one more time, Sergeant. If 4 times isn't enough to prove the point, then 5 times should do it." The training ground fell silent except for the distant sounds of other exercises being conducted elsewhere on the base. Even the wind seemed to pause as everyone processed what they'd just heard, a recruit asking for additional punishment, requesting the chance to push herself beyond what had already been demanded. Marcus studied her face, searching for signs of bravado or false courage that he could exploit. What he found instead was something that made him deeply uncomfortable. Genuine determination that seemed to run deeper than mere stubbornness or pride. 5 rope climbs is excessive, he said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction, even for someone who thinks they have something to prove. "With respect, Sergeant, I'm not trying to prove anything to you. I'm trying to prove something to myself." It was a distinction that cut through Marcus's carefully constructed worldview like a blade through silk. This wasn't about impressing him or winning approval from the system. This was about an individual testing their own limits and refusing to accept defeat as an option. For the first time in his career, Marcus found himself faced with someone whose motivation came from a place he didn't recognize or understand. Sarah wasn't performing for his approval or disapproval. She was engaged in a private battle with her own potential, and he was merely a spectator to that internal struggle. The 5th rope climb began like the others, but something fundamental had changed in the dynamic between Sarah and the challenge before her. This wasn't about following orders anymore. This was about answering a question that had been burning inside her since childhood. How far could she push herself when everything was on the line? Her ascent was slower this time, each movement deliberate and calculated as her body fought against the accumulated fatigue of the previous climbs. Marcus watched from below, and for the first time since this confrontation had begun, he found himself hoping she would succeed rather than waiting for her to fail. The other recruits had formed an unconscious semicircle around the base of the rope, their earlier mixture of sympathy and relief transformed into something approaching awe. They were witnessing something that transcended normal military training. This was about human will made manifest, about refusing to accept limitations that others tried to impose. Halfway up the rope, Sarah's grip began to slip. Her hands, slick with sweat and raw from friction, couldn't maintain their hold with the same confidence they'd shown during earlier climbs. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she hung suspended between success and failure, her entire body weight supported by fingers that burned like fire. Marcus tensed, ready to call for safety equipment if she fell, but Sarah found something deeper than physical strength to draw upon. She adjusted her grip, used her legs to take more of the load, and continued her climb with a determination that seemed to defy the laws of physiology. When she finally reached the top of the rope for the 5th time, the cheer that erupted from the assembled recruits was spontaneous and heartfelt. Even some of the other instructors who had gathered to watch this unprecedented display joined in the applause. But Sarah's descent was where everything changed. Perhaps it was fatigue, or maybe the emotional intensity of the moment, but as she began to lower herself down the rope, her grip failed completely. Instead of the controlled descent she'd managed 4 times before, Sarah found herself falling, her hands unable to maintain contact with the rope that had become her adversary and ally in equal measure. The fall wasn't from a dangerous height. She'd only descended about 8 feet when her grip gave out. But the angle was wrong, the landing awkward, and the impact devastating in ways that nobody could have predicted. Sarah hit the ground with a sickening crack that silenced every voice on the training ground. Her left leg, which had taken the brunt of the impact, was bent at an angle that made experienced soldiers wince and look away. The compound fracture was immediately apparent, bone visible through torn skin, blood beginning to pool in the dirt beneath her. For several seconds, the only sound was Sarah's sharp intake of breath as the reality of her injury registered. She lay motionless, her face pale, but her eyes still burning with that same inner fire that had driven her to attempt the 5th climb in the first place. Marcus was beside her in an instant, his training taking over as he assessed the injury and called for medical assistance. But as he knelt next to Sarah, preparing to offer words of comfort or reassurance, she spoke first. "Did I make it down?" she asked, her voice strained but steady. "What?" Marcus replied, confused by the question. "The fifth climb," Sarah clarified, trying to prop herself up on her elbows to get a better look at her injured leg. "Did I complete it, or does it not count because of the landing?" Marcus stared at her in disbelief. Here was someone with a bone protruding from their leg, lying in a growing pool of their own blood, and their primary concern was whether they'd successfully completed an exercise that had already gone far beyond any reasonable requirement. "Chen," he said softly, "you need to lie still until the medics get here. Don't worry about the climb." "But did I complete it?" she pressed, and Marcus could see that this wasn't about seeking validation or approval. This was about maintaining her own internal scorecard, about knowing whether she'd met the standard she'd set for herself. "Yes," Marcus said, though his voice was barely above a whisper. "You completed it." Sarah nodded and lay back down, seemingly satisfied with that confirmation. Around them, the other recruits maintained a respectful distance while the medical team rushed across the training ground with their equipment and expertise. But as Marcus continued to kneel beside Sarah, applying pressure to slow the bleeding and monitoring her condition, something unexpected began to happen. The walls he'd built around his emotions, reinforced by decades of military discipline and masculine conditioning, began to crack under the weight of what he'd just witnessed. This wasn't supposed to happen. Soldiers were supposed to be tough, unbreakable, immune to the kind of raw emotion that was now threatening to overwhelm him. But as he watched Sarah fight to remain conscious while waiting for medical treatment, as he saw the determination in her eyes even as her body betrayed her, Marcus felt something that he'd trained himself never to experience in front of others. His vision began to blur, and he realized with horror that tears were forming in his eyes. Real tears, the kind that real soldiers aren't supposed to cry, especially not in front of their recruits, especially not in response to someone else's pain and courage. The first tear that escaped Marcus Kane's eye felt like a betrayal of everything he'd built his identity upon. For 20 years, he'd been the rock that others leaned against, the unshakable foundation that never showed cracks or weakness. He was the sergeant who could deliver devastating news without flinching, who could watch recruits fail and wash out without batting an eye, who had earned his reputation precisely because he seemed immune to the emotional turbulence that affected lesser mortals. But as he knelt in the dirt beside Sarah Chen, watching her fight to stay conscious, while her life's blood seeped into the training ground, Marcus discovered that there were some things that could breach even the most carefully constructed emotional defenses. The medical team arrived with practiced efficiency, their movements precise and professional as they began the delicate process of stabilizing Sarah's condition. Marcus found himself reluctantly stepping back to give them room to work, but his eyes never left Sarah's face as she endured their ministrations with the same quiet strength she'd shown throughout the morning's ordeal. "Sergeant Kane!" called one of the medics. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately. This kind of injury requires surgical intervention within the hour if we want to save full function of the leg." Marcus nodded, his throat too tight to trust his voice to remain steady. Around him, the other recruits maintained their respectful distance, but he could feel their eyes on him, could sense their confusion at seeing their seemingly invincible instructor struggling to maintain composure. As the medical team prepared to transport Sarah, she managed to catch Marcus's eye one more time. Despite the pain medication they'd administered, despite the trauma her body had endured, her gaze was still clear and focused. "Sergeant," she said, her voice barely audible above the sounds of preparation around her. "Thank you." "For what?" Marcus managed to ask, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "For letting me find out," Sarah replied, and then she was being lifted onto a stretcher and carried away toward the waiting ambulance, leaving Marcus standing in a pool of her blood with questions he didn't know how to answer.
The aftermath of the incident unfolded with the mechanical precision that the military applied to all crises. Reports were filed, investigations were launched, and procedures were reviewed to determine if any protocols had been violated or if additional safety measures needed to be implemented. Marcus found himself called before a review board to explain the circumstances that had led to Sarah's injury. The questions were pointed but professional, focusing on whether he'd exceeded reasonable training parameters or failed to provide adequate safety oversight. Sergeant Kane asked Colonel Patricia Wells, who was leading the review, "In your professional opinion, was the fifth rope climb necessary for the assessment of Lieutenant Chen's capabilities?" Marcus had been dreading this question since the moment Sarah hit the ground. The honest answer was no. 4 rope climbs have already demonstrated her competence beyond any reasonable doubt. The 5th climb was about something else entirely, something that he was still struggling to understand or articulate. "No, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. The 5th climb was not necessary for assessment purposes. "Then why was it permitted?" Colonel Wells pressed. "What was the training objective that justified the additional risk?" Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, searching for words that could explain what had happened without sounding like he'd lost his mind or abandoned his responsibilities as an instructor. "Lieutenant Chen requested the 5th climb, ma'am. She had already exceeded our requirements, but she asked for the opportunity to test her own limits. I made the judgment that denying that request would have been counterproductive to her development as a soldier. It wasn't the complete truth, but it wasn't a lie either. Sarah had asked for that 5th climb, though Marcus knew that his role in creating the circumstances that led to that request was more complicated than his testimony suggested." Colonel Wells studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She'd known Marcus for years, had watched him train countless recruits with unwavering professionalism and exceptional results. This incident was unprecedented in his record, and she was trying to determine whether it represented an aberration or something more concerning. "Sergeant Kane," she said eventually, "are you satisfied that your judgment in this matter was sound?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Marcus felt the weight of every decision he'd made that morning pressing down on him. Was he satisfied with his judgment? Had he acted in Sarah's best interest, or had he allowed his own psychological conflicts to cloud his professional responsibilities? "Ma'am," he replied carefully, "I believe that Lieutenant Chen demonstrated qualities that day that are essential for military service. Whether my methods for revealing those qualities was optimal is a question I continue to wrestle with." It was as close to an admission of doubt as Marcus had ever made in a professional setting, and he could see the surprise in Colonel Wells' expression at his uncharacteristic candor. The review board ultimately concluded that while Marcus's judgment was questionable, no formal disciplinary action was warranted. Sarah's injury was classified as a training accident, and new safety protocols were implemented to prevent similar incidents in the future. But the real consequences of that morning couldn't be addressed by official reviews or policy changes. Marcus discovered that witnessing Sarah's combination of vulnerability and strength had fundamentally altered something in his psychological makeup, leaving him questioning assumptions that had guided his entire adult life.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. 3 days after Sarah's injury, Marcus found himself standing outside her hospital room, holding a small bouquet of flowers that he'd purchased from the gift shop downstairs. He'd been trying to work up the courage to knock on her door for the better part of an hour, rehearsing various versions of what he wanted to say and finding each one inadequate to the task. The truth was that Marcus had never been good at apologies or emotional conversations. His strength lay in clear commands, objective feedback, and the kind of straightforward communication that left no room for ambiguity or misinterpretation. But this situation called for something more nuanced, something that required him to venture into territory where his usual tools were useless. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of internal debate, he knocked softly on the door and waited for permission to enter. "Come in," came Sarah's voice from inside, and Marcus pushed open the door to find her propped up in bed, her injured leg elevated and encased in an impressive array of medical hardware. "Lieutenant Chen," he said formally, then caught himself. "Sarah, how are you feeling?" She looked surprised to see him, though not unpleasantly so. "Better than I expected, honestly. The doctors say the surgery went well and I should make a full recovery. Physical therapy is going to be interesting, but they think I'll be back to full duty in about 6 months." Marcus nodded, relieved to hear that her prognosis was positive. He'd been carried a weight of guilt about her injury that had made sleep nearly impossible for the past 3 nights. "I brought these," he said awkwardly, holding up the bouquet. "I wasn't sure what kind you might like, so I just picked something that looked nice." Sarah's face softened as she accepted the bouquet. "They're beautiful, Sergeant. Thank you. But you didn't need to do this." "Yes, I did," Marcus replied, his voice more intense than he'd intended. "Sarah, I need to apologize to you. What happened on that training ground was my fault, and I've been trying to figure out how to take responsibility for it." Sarah studied his face with the same intensity she'd shown during their confrontation 3 days earlier. "Sergeant, with respect, what happened was an accident. I chose to attempt that 5th climb. You didn't force me to do it. But I created the circumstances that made you feel like you needed to prove something. I pushed you harder than necessary, questioned your capabilities in ways that were designed to provoke exactly the kind of response you gave." "And why do you think you did that?" Sarah asked quietly. The question caught Marcus off guard. He'd expected her to either accept his apology or reject it, not turn it into a therapy session. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. "For 20 years, I've been training soldiers, and I've always been able to maintain professional distance. But something about you, about your determination and your refusal to back down, it got under my skin in ways I didn't understand." Sarah nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense to her. "Do you know what I was thinking about during that 5th climb?" Marcus shook his head, genuinely curious about her answer. "I was thinking about my father," Sarah said, her gaze drifting toward the window. "He died when I was 12, and one of the last things he told me was that I should never let anyone convince me that I was less capable than I believed myself to be. He said that the world would try to put me in boxes that were too small, and that it was my job to break out of them." Marcus felt something tighten in his chest as he processed her words. "And you saw me as someone trying to put you in a box." "She saw me as someone testing whether I was strong enough to break out of it," she corrected. "There's a difference." The distinction hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd thought he was trying to break her down, to force her to acknowledge her limitations and accept a more realistic assessment of her capabilities. But Sarah had interpreted his challenges as opportunities to demonstrate that his assumptions about her limitations were wrong. "The thing is, Sergeant," Sarah continued, "I don't think you were really testing me at all. I think you were testing yourself." "What do you mean?" Sarah shifted in her bed, wincing slightly as she adjusted her position. "I think you've spent so many years believing that strength looks a certain way, sounds a certain way, and comes from certain kinds of people, that when you encountered strength that didn't fit your expectations, it challenged everything you thought you knew about what makes a good soldier." Marcus stared at her in silence, processing the implications of what she'd just said. Was it possible that his reaction to Sarah had been less about her shortcomings and more about his own rigid thinking? "When I fell from that rope, and when you knelt down beside me, I saw something in your face that I don't think you're used to showing people." "What did you see?" "I saw someone who realized that they'd been wrong about something important, and I saw someone who cared enough about that realization to let them change them." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Marcus wasn't sure he was ready to fully acknowledge.
The conversation in Sarah's hospital room marked the beginning of a transformation that Marcus couldn't have imagined just a week earlier. As he left the hospital that afternoon, he found himself questioning not just his methods as an instructor, but the fundamental beliefs about strength, weakness, and human potential that had guided his entire military career. Over the following weeks, as Sarah began her recovery and Marcus returned to his training duties, he noticed changes in his approach that surprised him. The automatic assumptions he'd always made about which recruits would succeed and which would fail began to feel less certain, less reliable than they once had. There was Private Johnson, barely 19 years old and built like a scarecrow, who had always seemed destined to wash out of the program. But when Marcus looked more carefully, he saw the same quiet determination in Johnson's eyes that he'd learned to recognize in Sarah's. Instead of pushing Johnson to his breaking point, Marcus began looking for ways to build on the young man's existing strengths while gradually addressing his weaknesses. There was Corporal Martinez, whose emotional responses to stress had always marked her as potentially unsuitable for combat roles. But Marcus began to wonder if what he'd interpreted as emotional instability might actually be a form of empathy and situational awareness that could be valuable in the right circumstances. The changes in Marcus's approach didn't go unnoticed by his colleagues and superiors. Colonel Wells called him into her office 6 weeks after Sarah's accident to discuss what she diplomatically termed the evolution of his training methodology. "Colonel Kane," she said, gesturing for him to sit across from her desk, "I've been receiving some interesting reports about your recent work with recruits. Care to explain what's behind these changes?" Marcus had been expecting this conversation, though he still wasn't entirely sure how to articulate what had happened to him. "Ma'am, I've been reconsidering some of my assumptions about effective training methods." "Reconsidering in what way?" "I think I may have been too focused on identifying and exploiting weaknesses rather than identifying and developing strengths," Marcus said carefully. "The Lieutenant Chen incident made me realize that my methods might have been counterproductive in some cases." Colonel Wells leaned back in her chair, studying Marcus with the same intensity she'd shown during the review board hearing. "Are you suggesting that your previous methods were inappropriate?" "No, ma'am," Marcus replied quickly. "I'm suggesting that they may have been incomplete. I believe I was using a narrow definition of strength and capability that may have caused me to overlook or undervalue certain qualities that are actually essential for military service." It was a diplomatic way of saying that he'd been wrong about some fundamental things, and Colonel Wells seemed to understand the subtext of his words. "These new methods of yours, are they producing results?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus nodded. "Yes, graduation rates in my training groups have improved by 15% over the past month, and the quality assessments from follow-up instructors have been consistently positive." "And Lieutenant Chen, have you maintained contact with her during her recovery?" The question made Marcus slightly uncomfortable, though he wasn't entirely sure why. "Yes, ma'am, I've visited her a few times to check on her progress and discuss her plans for returning to duty." "What are her plans?" "She's determined to complete her training and return to active duty as soon as she's medically cleared. Her physical therapist says she's making exceptional progress and she should be ready to resume training in about 3 months. Colonel Wells made a note on the pad in front of her. "And you believe she should be allowed to return to your training program?" "Without question, ma'am," Marcus replied immediately. "Lieutenant Chen has demonstrated every quality we look for in a military officer. Her injury was an accident, not an indication of any deficiency in her capabilities." "Even though she was injured while attempting an exercise that exceeded standard requirements?" Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he considered his answer. "Ma'am, Lieutenant Chen was injured while pushing herself to discover her own limits. That kind of self-motivated excellence is exactly what we want in our officers. The fact that she encountered a setback while pursuing it doesn't diminish its value." Colonel Wells set down her pen and looked directly at Marcus. "Sergeant Kane, in all the years I've known you, I've never heard you speak about a recruit with this level of advocacy. Are you sure your judgment isn't being compromised by personal feelings?" The question hit Marcus like a cold wind. Was his judgment compromised? Had his emotional response to Sarah's injury and recovery affected his professional objectivity? Ma'am, I believe my judgment has been improved by a better understanding of what constitutes strength and capability in a military context. If that improvement came about through personal experience with Lieutenant Chen's situation, then I consider that a positive development rather than a compromise. It was perhaps the most honest thing Marcus had said in a professional setting in years, and he could see that Colonel Wells was somewhat taken aback by his candor. "Very well, Sergeant Kane," she said after a long pause. "Continue with your current methods, but I want detailed reports on outcomes and any incidents. And when Lieutenant Chen is ready to return to training, I want to be personally briefed on her progress." Marcus left Colonel Wells's office feeling both relieved and apprehensive. He'd successfully defended his new approach to training, but he also realized that he was now operating under increased scrutiny that could make any future problems much more consequential.
3 months after the accident, Sarah Chen walked back onto the training grounds at Fort Braxton with a slight limp that she tried unsuccessfully to hide and a determination that burned even brighter than before. Her physical therapy had been grueling, involving daily sessions that pushed her rebuilt leg through increasingly complex movements and stresses. The doctors had warned her that she might never regain full functionality, that there could be lasting limitations that would affect her military career. Sarah had responded to these warnings the same way she responded to most obstacles, by working twice as hard as anyone thought necessary and refusing to accept anything less than complete recovery. Marcus watched her approach from across the training ground, noting the subtle changes in her gait and the way she favored her right leg when she thought no one was looking. But he also saw something else, a quality of resilience that seemed to have been strengthened rather than diminished by her experience with serious injury and recovery. "Lieutenant Chen reporting for duty, Sergeant Kane," she said formally, though there was a warmth in her eyes that hadn't been there during their first encounters. "Welcome back, Lieutenant," Marcus replied, and he was surprised by how genuinely glad he was to see her return. "How are you feeling?" "Ready to get back to work," Sarah said simply. "My leg is at about 95%, and my physical therapist says that last 5% will come back with regular activity. I'm cleared for all standard exercises, with some modifications for the first few weeks." Marcus nodded, though he was already mentally adjusting his training plans to accommodate her situation. The Sarah Chen who had left in an ambulance 3 months ago had been driven by a need to prove herself. The woman standing before him now seemed to be motivated by something deeper and more sustainable, a genuine love for the challenge and a clear understanding of her own capabilities. "There's something I need to tell you," Marcus said, glancing around to ensure they had some privacy. "Your accident changed things for me, changed how I approach training, how I think about strength and capability. I wanted you to know that before we get back into the regular routine." Sarah studied his face with that same penetrating gaze he remembered from their hospital conversation. "Changed things how?" Marcus struggled to find the right words. How do you explain to someone that watching them suffer had taught you something fundamental about human nature? How do you admit that their pain had been the catalyst for your own growth? "I used to think that my job was to break people down and then build them back up stronger. But I've come to realize that some people don't need to be broken down at all. They just need to be given the space and support to show what they're already capable of. And you think I'm one of those people? I think you're someone who was always going to find your limits and push past them, regardless of what I did or didn't do. I just wish I'd been smart enough to recognize that earlier and avoid putting you at unnecessary risk." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing his words. When she spoke again, her voice carried a maturity that seemed to have developed during her months of recovery. "Sergeant, can I tell you something that might sound strange?" Marcus nodded. "I'm grateful for what happened," Sarah said, and Marcus felt his stomach drop. Not for the injury itself, obviously, but for everything that came after. The recovery taught me things about myself that I never would have learned otherwise. It showed me that I could handle setbacks and come back stronger. And it taught me that sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight with ourselves. Marcus stared at her in amazement.
Here was someone who had suffered a serious injury during training, who had spent months in painful rehabilitation, who still walked with a noticeable limp, expressing gratitude for the experience that had caused her so much hardship. More than that, Sarah continued, watching how you handled the situation, seeing how it affected you and how you grew from it, that taught me something important about leadership. Real leaders aren't the ones who never make mistakes. They're the ones who learn from their mistakes and become better because of them. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. In all his years of training recruits, he'd never had someone frame his failure as a learning opportunity, never had someone thank him for growing as a person rather than condemning him for his initial shortcomings. "Sarah," he said, and realized he was using her first name without thinking about military protocol. "I need you to know that what happened that day when you were injured, I cried. Right there in front of everyone. I broke down like I hadn't done since I was a child." Sarah's expression softened. "I know. I saw it." "You were unconscious," Marcus protested. "Not the whole time. I saw your face when the medics were working on me. I saw the tears." Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed by the admission even months later. "Real soldiers don't cry," he said, echoing the words he'd lived by for decades. "Real soldiers cry when it matters," Sarah corrected gently. "They cry when someone they care about is hurting. They cry when they realize they've made a mistake that hurts someone else. They cry when they're moved by courage or sacrifice or love." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other recruits beginning their morning training, but Marcus carried Sarah's words with him as they transitioned into the day's exercises. For the first time in his military career, he felt like he was learning as much from his students as he was teaching them.
As the weeks passed, Sarah's integration back into the training program became a masterclass in resilience and adaptation. Her physical limitations required creative modifications to standard exercises, but she approached each challenge with the same methodical determination that had characterized her original training. Marcus found himself watching her more closely than he watched other recruits, though his attention now came from professional interest rather than skepticism. Sarah had become a case study in how to overcome setbacks and maintain momentum in the face of adversity, and her example was influencing the entire training group. There was the morning when Private Rodriguez, struggling with confidence issues that were affecting his performance, watched Sarah complete a modified obstacle course that accommodated her healing leg. Instead of seeing weakness or limitation, Rodriguez saw someone who refused to let circumstances define their capabilities. The shift in his attitude was immediate and profound. There was the afternoon when Corporal Williams, dealing with her own doubts about whether she belonged in combat training, observed Sarah working through a complex tactical exercise that required her to adapt standard procedures to account for her physical constraints. Williams began to understand that excellence wasn't about perfect execution of predetermined methods. It was about achieving objectives, regardless of the obstacles. Marcus realized that Sarah's return had created an unexpected opportunity for him to demonstrate the evolution in his own thinking. Instead of hiding her limitations or pretending they didn't exist, he openly incorporated them into training scenarios, showing the entire group how to adapt and overcome rather than simply pushing through or giving up. The thing about real-world situations, Marcus explained to his recruits during a tactical briefing, is that they rarely conform to textbook scenarios. Equipment fails, people get injured, conditions change, and your job as soldiers is to accomplish the mission regardless of these complications. He gestured towards Sarah, who was studying the tactical map with the same intensity she brought to every challenge. Lieutenant Chen is giving us an opportunity to practice adaptation under realistic constraints. Her situation isn't a liability, it's a training advantage that's making all of you better soldiers. Sarah looked up from the map, meeting Marcus's eyes with a slight smile that acknowledged the significant distance they'd both traveled since their first confrontation months earlier. The relationship between them had evolved into something that was part mentor-student, part mutual respect society, and part shared understanding of what it meant to grow as a person. During one particularly challenging exercise that involved night navigation through difficult terrain,
Sarah's team encountered a situation where her physical limitations became a genuine tactical consideration. The route they'd planned required a level of agility and speed that her healing leg couldn't accommodate, and the team had to make real-time decisions about how to adapt their approach. Marcus watched from a distance as the team huddled around Sarah, not to exclude her from the mission, but to figure out how to modify their tactics to ensure everyone could contribute effectively. What he saw was exactly what he'd hoped to develop in his training program: soldiers who viewed challenges as problems to be solved rather than obstacles to be overcome through brute force. The solution they developed was elegant and practical. Instead of following the original route that required climbing and jumping, they identified an alternative path that was longer but more manageable for Sarah's condition. The trade-off was that they'd need to move faster on the easier terrain to make up time, which required better coordination and communication from the entire team. By the end of the exercise, Sarah's team had not only completed their objective, but had done so in a way that demonstrated the kind of tactical flexibility and adaptive thinking that Marcus had been trying to teach for years. The constraints imposed by her injury had forced them to become more creative, more collaborative, and ultimately more effective. "How did that feel?" Marcus asked Sarah privately after the exercise concluded. "Like being part of a real team," she replied without hesitation. "For the first time since I started training, I felt like my contribution was valued not despite my limitations, but because of how I handled them." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The early stages of military training often focused so heavily on individual performance and meeting standardized benchmarks that recruits lost sight of the collaborative nature of actual military service. Sarah's situation had created natural opportunities for team building and mutual support that were often difficult to replicate in artificial training scenarios. "There's something else," Sarah continued, her expression becoming more serious. "I've been thinking about what I want to do when I complete this training program." "Oh?" Marcus asked, curious about her plans. "I want to become an instructor," Sarah said. "I want to work with recruits who are dealing with challenges that make them think they don't belong or who are struggling to see their own potential." Marcus felt a surge of pride mixed with something that might have been paternal affection. The idea of Sarah as an instructor felt not just appropriate, but inevitable. She had learned lessons about resilience, adaptation, and leadership that could only come from direct experience with adversity. "I think you'd be exceptional at that," Marcus said honestly, "but you know it won't be easy. Military instruction requires a different kind of strength than what you've been developing as a recruit." Sarah's smile was confident but not arrogant. "I've learned a few things about different kinds of strength over the past few months. I think I'm ready for whatever comes next."
The transformation in Marcus Kane's approach to military training had ripple effects that extended far beyond his immediate group of recruits. Word of his innovative methods and improved outcomes had begun to circulate among the training staff at Fort Braxton, generating both curiosity and skepticism from his peers. Some instructors were intrigued by reports of his higher graduation rates and the positive feedback from follow-up training programs. They wanted to understand what had changed in his methodology and whether those changes could be replicated in their own work. Others were more suspicious, viewing his evolution as a sign of weakness or compromise of standards. They worried that he was going soft on recruits, that his emphasis on adaptation and individual strengths might be producing soldiers who lacked the mental toughness necessary for combat situations. Marcus found himself caught between these competing perspectives, trying to defend his new methods while continuing to refine and improve them based on ongoing results. The situation came to a head during a monthly training review meeting where instructors gathered to discuss best practices and share insights about their programs. "Kane," called out Sergeant First Class Bradley Thompson, a 25-year veteran known for his traditional approach to recruit training, "I've been hearing some interesting stories about your methods lately. Care to share what's behind all these changes?" Marcus had been expecting this conversation for weeks, and he'd spent considerable time preparing for it. He knew that his credibility with his peers was crucial, not just for his own career, but for the future of the training innovations he'd been developing.
I've been experimenting with approaches that focus more on individual strengths and adaptive problem solving, Marcus replied carefully. The goal is still to produce exceptional soldiers, but I found that different people respond better to different types of challenges and support. Sounds like you're coddling them, Thompson said bluntly. Military service isn't about individual comfort zones. It's about learning to function effectively under stress, following orders, and maintaining discipline regardless of personal preferences. I agree completely, Marcus said, surprising Thompson with his immediate agreement. But I've found that helping people understand and develop their natural strengths actually makes them more effective under stress, not less. A soldier who knows their capabilities and limitations is more reliable than one who's simply been broken down and rebuilt according to a standard template. The room had grown quiet as other instructors listened to this exchange. Marcus could feel the weight of their attention and the importance of making his case clearly and convincingly. Let me give you a specific example, Marcus continued. I have a recruit named Johnson who's physically small and not naturally aggressive. Under traditional training methods, we'd focus on pushing him harder, making him more aggressive, trying to build physical intimidation skills that don't suit his natural temperament. And your new approach? Asked Captain Lisa Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing the conversation. My new approach recognizes that Johnson has exceptional situational awareness, strong analytical skills, and natural leadership qualities that emerge when he's not constantly fighting against his nature. Instead of trying to turn him into something he's not, I've been developing training scenarios that let him use those strengths while still building the physical and tactical skills he needs. Marcus pulled out a folder of documentation he'd prepared for this meeting. Johnson's performance scores have improved by 30% since I changed his training focus. More importantly, his team performance scores have improved because he's become an effective tactical coordinator rather than trying to be a frontline fighter. Thompson frowned as he reviewed the documentation. But what happens when Johnson gets deployed and finds himself in a situation where he needs to be that frontline fighter? What if his team is counting on him to be aggressive and intimidating? Then he'll adapt, Marcus replied confidently. Because he understands his own capabilities and limitations, he'll be able to make better tactical decisions about when to push forward and when to find alternative approaches. He won't waste time trying to be something he's not, and he won't compromise the mission by overestimating his abilities. The conversation continued for another hour, with various instructors sharing their own experiences and observations about different training approaches. Marcus found himself defending not just his methods, but the underlying philosophy that had emerged from his experience with Sarah Chen. As the meeting concluded, Captain Rodriguez approached Marcus privately. Kane, I've been watching your results for the past few months, and I'm impressed, but I'm also concerned about scalability. Your approach seems to require a lot of individual attention and customization. How do we implement something like this across the entire training program? It was a fair question that Marcus had been grappling with himself. His new methods did require more time and attention per recruit, more flexibility in exercise design, and more sophisticated assessment techniques than traditional approaches. I think the key is training instructors to recognize and develop individual strengths rather than just identify and correct weaknesses. It's not about lowering standards or reducing intensity. It's about being more strategic and effective in how we apply that intensity. Captain Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. I'd like you to put together a formal proposal for a pilot program. If we can demonstrate that these methods work consistently across multiple instructors and training groups, we might be able to implement them more broadly. Marcus felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. The opportunity to influence military training on a larger scale was exactly what he'd hoped for, but it also meant that his innovations would face much more rigorous scrutiny and testing.
6 months after Sarah Chen's return to training, Marcus Kane found himself standing in front of a conference room full of senior military officials, preparing to present the results of his pilot training program to a review board that would determine whether his methods could be implemented across multiple military installations. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If his presentation was successful, it could revolutionize how the military approached recruit training, potentially improving outcomes for thousands of future soldiers. If it failed, it would likely end his career and validate the critics who had argued that his methods were too soft for military application. Sarah sat in the back of the room, having been invited as a case study participant. She had successfully completed her training program 2 months earlier, graduating with honors despite the challenges posed by her injury and recovery. More importantly, she had been accepted into the instructor training program, fulfilling her goal of becoming someone who could help other recruits navigate their own challenges and discover their potential. Marcus began his presentation with the data that had convinced Captain Rodriguez to support the pilot program. Graduate retention rates had improved by 22% across the 3 instructors who had implemented his modified approaches. Performance evaluations from follow-up training programs had shown consistent improvements in leadership, adaptability, and team effectiveness. The traditional model of military training, Marcus explained to the assembled officials, was designed for a different era when military service was primarily about following orders and executing predetermined procedures. Modern military operations require soldiers who can think critically, adapt quickly, and work effectively in diverse teams under unpredictable conditions. He clicked to the next slide, which showed comparative performance data from traditional and modified training approaches. Our pilot program demonstrates that recruits who are trained using individualized strength development show superior performance in complex problem-solving scenarios, leadership situations, and adaptive challenges. General Patricia Hammond, who is leading the review, raised her hand. Sergeant Kane, these results are impressive, but I'm concerned about the resource requirements. Your methods seem to require significantly more instructor time and attention per recruit. How do we scale this approach without dramatically increasing training costs? Marcus had anticipated this question and had spent weeks developing his response. Ma'am, the initial investment in more intensive instructor training and individualized assessment is offset by improved retention rates and reduced need for remedial training. When we factor in the cost of recruiting and training replacement personnel for those who wash out under traditional methods, the modified approach actually shows a net cost reduction over a 2-year period. He presented the financial analysis that supported his claim, showing how the pilot program's higher success rates translated into measurable cost savings despite the increased upfront investment. Colonel James Mitchell, another member of the review board, leaned forward in his chair. Sergeant Kane, I've read the reports about the incident that apparently inspired these changes in your methodology. Are you confident that your judgment hasn't been compromised by emotional factors related to that situation? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Marcus could feel every person in the room waiting for his response. This was the moment he'd been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. Sir, Marcus replied, his voice steady and clear. The incident with Lieutenant Chen taught me that my previous assumptions about strength, capability, and potential were incomplete. It forced me to examine whether my training methods were actually producing the best possible outcomes, or whether they were simply perpetuating approaches that felt familiar and comfortable. He paused, gathering his thoughts for what he knew would be the most important part of his presentation. The emotional impact of that incident was significant, but the professional insights it generated have been validated by months of systematic testing and measurement. The data speaks for itself. These methods work not because they make training easier or more comfortable, but because they make training more effective and more aligned with the actual demands of modern military service. He gestured towards Sarah in the back of the room. Lieutenant Chen is here today not as a symbol of my emotional response to her injury, but as evidence of what's possible when we train people to maximize their existing strengths while systematically addressing their limitations.
General Hammond looked towards Sarah. Lieutenant Chen, would you care to comment on your experience with Sergeant Kane's training methods? Sarah stood and moved to the front of the room with the same confident bearing she'd shown on the training ground, though Marcus noticed she still favored her right leg slightly when walking. Ma'am, Sarah began, I believe Sergeant Kane's evolution as an instructor represents exactly the kind of adaptive leadership we need in modern military service. He recognized that his original approach wasn't producing optimal results. He analyzed what needed to change, and he implemented improvements based on evidence rather than tradition. More importantly, his methods don't lower standards or reduce intensity. They make standards more meaningful and intensity more purposeful. Every challenge in his training program is designed to develop specific capabilities that directly translate to military effectiveness. Nothing is included simply because that's how we've always done it. Sarah's endorsement carried weight, not just because of her personal experience, but because of her academic background in organizational psychology and her demonstrated commitment to military service despite significant personal cost. The review session continued for another 2 hours, with detailed questions about implementation protocols, instructor training requirements, and measurement criteria for success. Marcus answered each question with the thoroughness and precision that had characterized his entire approach to developing these new methods.
2 years after that fateful morning on the training grounds at Fort Braxton, Marcus Kane stood before a new group of recruits, his approach to instruction transformed by lessons learned through pain, growth, and the courage to admit when long-held beliefs needed to be examined and evolved. The approval of his training methods by the Military Review Board had been unanimous, though implementation across multiple installations had proven to be a complex and ongoing process. Not every instructor was willing or able to adapt their approach, and not every training facility had the resources to fully implement the individualized assessment and development protocols that Marcus had pioneered. But the successes had been undeniable. Graduate retention rates had improved across every installation that had implemented the modified training approaches. More importantly, feedback from combat units indicated that soldiers trained using these methods showed superior performance in complex, adaptive situations that required creative problem-solving and team coordination. Sarah Chen, now instructor Lieutenant Sarah Chen, worked at a training facility 3 states away, where she had become known for her ability to identify and develop potential in recruits who might have been overlooked by traditional assessment methods. Her reputation had grown beyond her own installation, and she frequently received requests to consult on challenging cases where recruits showed promise but didn't fit standard profiles for military success. The correspondence between Marcus and Sarah had continued throughout her instructor training and early career, evolving from mentor-student exchanges to conversations between professional equals who shared a commitment to excellence in military education. Their relationship had become a testament to the possibility of growth, forgiveness, and mutual respect, even after serious mistakes and difficult circumstances. On this particular morning, as Marcus prepared to address his newest group of recruits, he reflected on how fundamentally his understanding of strength and leadership had changed. The sergeant, who had once believed that real soldiers don't cry, had learned that real soldiers cry when it matters, that vulnerability and strength could coexist, and that the most effective leaders were those who could admit their mistakes and grow from them. "Good morning," Marcus called out to the assembled recruits, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of experience but tempered by wisdom earned through personal transformation. "My job is not to break you down and rebuild you according to some predetermined template. My job is to help you understand your own strengths, address your limitations, and develop the skills and mindset necessary to serve effectively alongside your fellow soldiers." The recruits exchanged glances, clearly not expecting this type of introduction from a senior military instructor. Most had prepared themselves for the kind of aggressive, confrontational approach that was portrayed in movies and described by friends who had gone through traditional military training. "That doesn't mean training will be easy or comfortable," Marcus clarified, his tone becoming more serious. "Military service demands excellence, and excellence requires pushing beyond what you currently believe is possible. But I've learned that the most effective way to help people reach their potential is to understand and develop their natural strengths while systematically addressing areas that need improvement. As the morning progressed, Marcus implemented the assessment and training protocols that had evolved from his experience with Sarah and been refined through 2 years of pilot programs and feedback. Instead of immediately subjecting recruits to standardized tests designed to identify weaknesses, he began with exercises that revealed individual strengths, learning styles, and motivation factors. There was Private Adams, whose small stature and quiet demeanor might have marked him for special attention under Marcus's old approach, but whose analytical skills and tactical thinking became apparent during problem-solving exercises. Instead of trying to make Adams more physically intimidating, Marcus began developing scenarios that leveraged his natural strategic capabilities while still building the physical skills he needed. There was Corporal Jackson, whose emotional responses to stress had initially seemed like a liability, but whose empathy and interpersonal awareness made her exceptionally effective at team coordination and conflict resolution. Rather than trying to suppress these qualities, Marcus worked with Jackson to channel them into leadership skills that would serve her throughout her military career. And there was Recruit Thompson, whose obvious physical capabilities and natural aggression could have easily been his primary focus, but whose impulsiveness and difficulty with complex instructions required patient development of self-discipline and tactical thinking. Marcus learned to balance Thompson's strengths with targeted work on areas that needed improvement. As the weeks passed, Marcus watched his recruits develop not just as individual soldiers, but as a cohesive unit that leveraged each member's unique capabilities while supporting areas where others needed assistance. The transformation was gradual but profound, and it reminded him daily of the lessons he had learned from Sarah Chen about the relationship between vulnerability, strength, and authentic leadership. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter from Sarah that included a photograph of her latest graduating class, 32 recruits who had successfully completed training despite various challenges that might have led to their dismissal under traditional approaches. The photo showed confident, capable soldiers whose diversity of backgrounds and capabilities had been transformed into a unified commitment to excellence and service. Marcus, Sarah's letter read, I wanted you to see what's possible when we have the courage to question our assumptions and grow from our mistakes. These soldiers will serve with honor because they were trained by instructors who understood that real strength comes not from conforming to narrow definitions of what a soldier should be, but from developing each person's unique potential in service of shared goals. Marcus smiled as he finished reading the letter, remembering the broken young woman who had asked him if she'd completed her 5th rope climb while lying in a pool of her own blood. That question had started a journey of transformation and had changed not just his career, but his fundamental understanding of what it meant to serve, to lead, and to grow. The tears that came to his eyes as he looked at Sarah's photograph were tears of pride, gratitude, and recognition that sometimes the most important lessons come through the hardest experiences. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Kane was completely comfortable with the fact that real soldiers do cry when it matters, when it makes them better, and when it reminds them of their shared humanity in service of something greater. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.